What happens when family loyalty becomes a weapon and the person you trust most wants you dead? This is the story of Eddie Ashton-Davenport, a 15-year-old boy who discovered that blood isn't always thicker than water. Sometimes it's deadlier. The October mist clung to the Oxfordshire countryside like a shroud as Eddie adjusted his shooting jacket for the third time. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from anticipation mixed with dread. Sir Quentin Marwood, his uncle and legal guardian, had insisted on this bonding experience at the family's sprawling Marwood estate. For 3 months since his father's death, Eddie had been living under Quentin's suffocating supervision, feeling more like a prisoner than a nephew. "Ready for your first proper English shoot, my boy?" Quentin's voice carried that familiar edge of condescension as he emerged from the gunroom, a vintage Purdy shotgun cradled in his arms like a baby. His weathered face wore a smile that never quite reached his pale blue eyes. "Time you learned what it means to be a Marwood." Eddie nodded reluctantly, shouldering his own weapon, a lighter gun his father had given him 2 Christmases ago. The irony wasn't lost on him that the last gift from his deceased father might be used in whatever twisted lesson his uncle had planned. The estate grounds stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with ancient oaks and crossed by stone walls that had stood for centuries. A handful of beaters moved through the underbrush, their voices echoing across the valley as they drove the game birds toward the waiting guns. Other members of the shooting party, mostly Quentin's business associates and social climbing neighbors, had positioned themselves at various stands throughout the estate. "This way, Edward," Quentin commanded, using Eddie's full name with deliberate formality. "I've saved the best position for us, father and son, as it were." The words stung. Eddie bit back his response, following his uncle along a narrow footpath that led away from the other shooters. They climbed steadily upward, past a crumbling gamekeeper's cottage and through a copse of birch trees whose leaves rustled ominously in the strengthening wind. "Uncle Quentin," Eddie ventured as they walked, "shouldn't we stay closer to the others? I thought shoots were supposed to be group activities." Quentin paused, turning to study his nephew with those calculating eyes. "Ah, but this is special, my dear boy. Private instruction. Can't have you embarrassing the family name in front of the county set, can we?" They emerged onto a high bluff overlooking the valley below. The view was spectacular. Rolling green hills stretched to the horizon, punctuated by the spires of distant villages. But something felt wrong. The isolation was complete. No other shooters were visible, and even the beaters' voices had faded to nothing. "Perfect," Quentin murmured, more to himself than to Eddie. He checked his watch, an expensive Rolex that caught the weak sunlight. "Right on schedule." "Schedule for what?" Eddie asked, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Quentin's smile widened, and for the first time it reached his eyes. But there was no warmth there, only a predatory gleam. "For your education, nephew. You see, there are certain realities about our family that you need to understand. Your father was always too soft, too sentimental. He never grasped the true nature of power." Eddie took an instinctive step backward, his grip tightening on his shotgun. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about inheritance, my boy. About legacy. About the unfortunate tendency of young heirs to meet with tragic accidents." Quentin raised his gun casually, as if checking the mechanism, but Eddie noticed how his finger rested near the trigger. "Hunting can be so dangerous, you know, especially for inexperienced boys who don't know their place." The truth hit Eddie like a physical blow. His uncle, his father's own brother, was planning to kill him. Here, in this isolated spot, with no witnesses, and a perfect cover story already prepared. An unfortunate hunting accident, a grieving uncle, a substantial inheritance that would pass to the next in line. "You're insane," Eddie whispered, backing toward the edge of the bluff. "Am I, or am I simply practical?" Quentin's voice remained conversational, almost friendly. "Your father left you everything, the London properties, the trust funds, even a controlling interest in the shipping company. But you're just a child, a weak, emotional child who'll fritter away generations of family wealth on charity and sentiment." Eddie's mind raced. The bluff dropped away behind him, a sheer fall of perhaps 30 feet into dense woodland. To his left and right, the ground sloped steeply down rocky outcroppings. Only the path they'd taken offered a safe route back to civilization, and Quentin blocked that completely. "People will ask questions," Eddie said desperately. "The other shooters will confirm that I tried to teach you proper gun safety," Quentin interrupted smoothly. "They'll testify that you were nervous, inexperienced, that you wandered off despite my warnings. When they find your body at the bottom of this bluff, they'll naturally assume you lost your footing while trying to get a better shot." A pheasant burst from the undergrowth nearby, its wings beating frantically as it escaped into the gray sky. The sudden movement made both of them start, and in that split second of distraction, Eddie saw his chance. "You'll never get away with this!" he shouted, and dove sideways off the bluff. Quentin's shotgun boomed behind him, the pellets whistling past his head as Eddie crashed through the canopy of smaller trees growing on the steep slope. Branches tore at his clothes and skin as he tumbled, unable to control his descent. His own gun went flying, lost somewhere in the tangle of brush and rock. He hit the bottom hard, his left leg twisting unnaturally beneath him as pain exploded through his entire body. Above, he could hear Quentin shouting, not in alarm, but in fury. "You little fool! You've ruined everything!" Eddie tried to stand and immediately collapsed as agony shot through his injured leg. He could taste blood in his mouth, and something warm was trickling down his forehead. Through the trees above, he caught a glimpse of his uncle's face, red with rage as he peered over the edge of the bluff. Then the rain began to fall. The October rain fell in torrents, transforming the Oxfordshire woodland into a treacherous maze of mud and shadows. Eddie lay crumpled at the bottom of the bluff, his body screaming in agony as cold water soaked through his torn hunting jacket. Above him, Quentin's voice had faded to nothing. Either his uncle had given up the search or was planning something far worse. Eddie's left leg throbbed with each heartbeat, twisted at an unnatural angle beneath a fallen branch. When he tried to move, white-hot pain shot through his entire body, leaving him gasping and nauseous. His vision blurred, and he could taste copper in his mouth where his teeth had cut his tongue during the fall. The rain mixed with blood on his forehead, creating pink rivulets that stung his eyes. "Think, Eddie, think," he whispered through chattering teeth, his breath forming small clouds in the increasingly frigid air. The temperature was dropping fast, and his wet clothes were stealing what little body heat he had left. Hypothermia would kill him long before anyone found him, if anyone was even looking. He fumbled in his jacket pockets with numb fingers, searching for his mobile phone. The device was there, but the screen remained black when he pressed the power button. Wire damage, or perhaps it had been smashed during the fall. Either way, it was useless. No one knew where he was. Quentin would tell the other shooters that Eddie had wandered off despite warnings that search efforts were underway. By the time they organized a proper search party, it would be too late. The woods around him seemed to press closer as darkness began to fall. Ancient oaks creaked ominously in the wind, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the rain was muffled to a steady drip, drip, drip on the forest floor. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of dogs barking, the hunting party's hounds perhaps, or farm dogs from one of the nearby estates. Eddie closed his eyes, trying to conserve energy and think clearly despite the pain. He needed shelter, warmth, and medical attention, in that order. But first, he had to get out from under this branch without making his leg injury worse. The irony wasn't lost on him. His uncle had wanted this to look like a hunting accident, and now Eddie was genuinely facing death in the woods, alone and broken. That's when he heard it, the soft nickering of a horse somewhere nearby. Eddie's eyes snapped open. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the gentle thud of hooves on wet earth. Through the tangle of undergrowth, he caught a glimpse of silver-gray flanks moving between the trees. A loose horse, probably spooked by the storm and separated from its rider. "Here, Eddie!" called out weakly, his voice barely carrying over the rain. The movement stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence except for the steady patter of rain on leaves. Then, slowly, deliberately, the horse began moving toward him. Eddie held his breath as the animal emerged from behind a massive oak trunk, its coat dark with rain, but unmistakably beautiful even in the dim light. It was a thoroughbred, probably worth more than most people's houses, with the refined features and elegant bearing of expensive breeding. But something was wrong with its eyes. They held a wildness, a deep-seated fear that Eddie recognized instantly. This wasn't just a spooked horse, this was a traumatized animal, one that knew what it meant to be hurt and abandoned. "Easy, boy," Eddie whispered, extending his hand slowly. "Easy there." The horse, a stallion, Eddie realized, snorted nervously, but didn't bolt. Instead, it took another cautious step forward, neck stretched out to catch Eddie's scent. There was something almost human in its dark brown eyes, an intelligence that seemed to assess Eddie's condition and find him non-threatening. "That's it," Eddie encouraged, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the pain. "I'm hurt too, aren't I? We're quite a pair." The stallion moved closer, close enough that Eddie could see the faded scars along its flanks, evidence of harsh treatment, probably from previous owners. This horse had been through hell, just like Eddie was going through now. The realization created an instant bond between them, two damaged souls recognizing kindred spirits in each other. With enormous effort, Eddie managed to shift his position slightly, wincing as his injured leg protested. The stallion watched every movement with alert attention, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But Eddie's obvious pain and vulnerability seemed to reassure the animal rather than frighten it. "I need help," Eddie said aloud, as much to himself as to the horse. "I can't stay here. The cold will kill me before morning." As if understanding, the stallion stepped closer still, lowering its magnificent head to nuzzle Eddie's outstretched hand. The animal's breath was warm against his frozen fingers, and for the first time since the fall, Eddie felt a spark of hope. "You're not wearing a saddle," Eddie observed, running his hand along the horse's neck. "No bridle either. You're running free, aren't you? Just like I want to be." The connection between them deepened with each gentle touch. The stallion seemed to sense Eddie's desperation, his need for help, and some ancient instinct, perhaps the same one that had once made horses partners to humans rather than prey, kicked in. The animal positioned itself alongside Eddie as if offering itself as support. Eddie knew what he had to do, even though the thought terrified him. Somehow, he had to get onto this horse's back and find his way to safety. The stallion was large enough to carry him, and horses had an innate ability to navigate terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. It was his only chance. "I'm going to try to get up," Eddie told the horse, gripping a handful of mane with his good hand. "Please, please." The effort to pull himself upright sent waves of agony through his broken leg, but Eddie gritted his teeth and persevered. The stallion stood perfectly still, as if carved from stone, allowing Eddie to use its body for support. It was a testament to the animal's intelligence and compassion, qualities that Eddie desperately needed right now. With his good leg and both arms, Eddie managed to haul himself partially upright, leaning heavily against the stallion's side. The horse's warmth seeped through his wet clothes, providing blessed relief from the cold that was slowly killing him. But getting onto the animal's back would require every ounce of strength he had left. "One chance," Eddie muttered, gathering himself for the attempt. "Just give me one chance." The stallion turned its head to look at him, and in that moment, Eddie could have sworn he saw understanding in those dark eyes. The horse knew what was at stake. It knew that both their lives might depend on what happened next. Eddie took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and prepared to fight for his life. The morning mist hung low over the Oxfordshire countryside as Lady Beatrice Fortescue guided her chestnut mare along the familiar bridle path that wound through the ancient woodlands surrounding Hopewell Manor. At 62, she maintained the erect posture and keen eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle, her silver hair pulled back beneath a well-worn riding helmet. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and her breath formed small clouds as she navigated the narrow trail that had been carved through these woods by generations of riders before her. Something was wrong. Her mare, Duchess, had her ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring at a scent that didn't belong in their peaceful domain. Lady Beatrice had learned to trust her horse's instincts over the decades. Duchess had an uncanny ability to sense trouble long before humans could detect it. The mare's steps became increasingly agitated as they rounded a bend near the old gamekeeper's cottage, and that's when Lady Beatrice saw them. A boy and a horse, both clearly in distress, huddled together beside a fallen oak tree. The sight was so unexpected, so out of place in the meticulously maintained grounds of her estate, that for a moment she thought she might be hallucinating. But as Duchess whickered softly and received an answering nicker from the strange horse, Lady Beatrice realized this was terrifyingly real. "Good Lord," she breathed, dismounting quickly and approaching the pair with the caution of someone who understood that frightened creatures, both human and animal, could be unpredictable. The boy appeared to be unconscious, his hunting jacket torn and muddy, with what looked like dried blood on his forehead. The horse, a magnificent silver-gray thoroughbred, stood protectively over him, muscles tense and ready to flee at the first sign of threat. "Easy, boy," Lady Beatrice murmured, in the same tone she'd used to calm countless nervous horses over the years. "I'm here to help." She could see immediately that both the boy and the stallion were suffering from exposure. Their clothes and coat, respectively, were soaked through, and she could detect the subtle signs of hypothermia in the way the boy's lips had turned blue. The thoroughbred allowed her to approach, though every line of his body spoke of deep trauma and mistrust. Lady Beatrice had spent enough time around abused horses to recognize the signs. The way he flinched when she moved too quickly, the whites of his eyes showing when she reached for her mobile phone to call for help. This animal had been hurt badly and recently. "Mrs. Havisham, it's Beatrice," she said, when her wife answered the emergency call. "I need you to bring the Land Rover to the old bridle path near Keeper's Cottage immediately. And call Dr. Morrison. Tell him it's urgent. We have an injured boy and what appears to be a rescue situation." Eleanor Haversham had been Lady Beatrice's partner for 37 years and her legal wife for the past decade, ever since Britain had finally allowed people like them to marry with dignity. Where Beatrice was impulsive and emotional, Eleanor was methodical and practical, qualities that had made her one of London's most respected barristers before her retirement to the countryside. The urgency in her wife's voice told Eleanor everything she needed to know about the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, Eleanor arrived with their estate manager, Thomas Whitfield, a sturdy man in his 50s who had worked for the family since he was a teenager. Between the three of them, they managed to carefully lift the semi-conscious boy into the back of the Land Rover, while the stallion followed closely behind, as if unwilling to let his human companion out of sight. "What's your name, dear?" Lady Beatrice asked gently, as the boy's eyes fluttered open during the short drive back to the manor house. He tried to speak, but could only manage a hoarse whisper that sounded like, "Eddie." The effort seemed to exhaust him, and he slipped back into unconsciousness before they could learn more. Hopewell Manor rose before them like something from a Jane Austen novel, a perfectly proportioned Georgian mansion of honey-colored Cotswold stone, its windows gleaming in the morning sunlight and its chimneys sending up thin spirals of smoke into the clear autumn sky. The house had been in Eleanor's family for 8 generations, though she and Beatrice had transformed it from a cold, formal ancestral seat into a warm home that reflected their values of compassion and progressive thinking. Dr. Morrison, a man who had been making house calls in the area for over 40 years, arrived within the hour and immediately set about examining their unexpected guest in the Blue Room, the manor's most comfortable guest bedroom, with its view over the rose garden and its fireplace already crackling with a welcoming fire that Eleanor had hastily lit. The stallion remained in the courtyard below, visible through the tall windows, refusing to be led to the stables until he could see that his young companion was being cared for. "Mild concussion, severe bruising to the ribs, and a hairline fracture of the left fibula," Dr. Morrison announced after his thorough examination. "Nothing life-threatening, but he's going to need several weeks of rest and careful monitoring. He's also suffering from mild hypothermia and dehydration. Another few hours in those woods and we might have been looking at a very different outcome." The boy, Eddie, as they'd learned from the identification in his wallet that revealed his full name as Edward Ashton-Davenport, remained unconscious for most of the first day. Eleanor had contacted the local police to report finding him, but something about the circumstances struck her as odd. No missing person reports had been filed, despite the fact that the boy was obviously from a wealthy family, judging by his expensive hunting attire and the fact that he'd been accompanied by a thoroughbred worth more than most people's annual salaries. "There's something not right about this whole situation," Eleanor murmured to her wife as they sat in their private sitting room that evening, watching through the window as the stallion, whom they'd begun calling Sterling because of his distinctive silver-gray coat, paced restlessly in the paddock where Thomas had finally managed to coax him. That boy didn't just wander off and get lost. Someone either abandoned him or he was running from something. Lady Beatrice nodded grimly. "Did you see the way he flinched when Dr. Morrison mentioned contacting his family? Even unconscious, he seemed to recoil from the suggestion." She paused, watching Sterling's agitated movements. "And that horse, I've never seen an animal so devoted to a human being. He won't eat, won't drink, just keeps watching those windows as if he's standing guard." The truth began to emerge the following morning when Eddie finally regained full consciousness. He woke with a start, panic in his eyes as he tried to orient himself in the unfamiliar but elegant surroundings. Lady Beatrice, who had been dozing in a chair beside his bed, immediately moved to reassure him. "You're safe, dear," she said softly. "I'm Lady Beatrice Fortescue, and you're at Hopewell Manor. We found you yesterday morning in the woods with your horse. Do you remember what happened?" Eddie's face crumpled as the memories came flooding back. The hunting accident that wasn't an accident, his uncle's cold-blooded attempt to murder him, the terrifying fall from the bluff, and the long, cold night in the rain. When he tried to speak, the words came out in a torrent of pain and fear that made Lady Beatrice's heart ache with sympathy and fury in equal measure. "My uncle, Sir Quentin Marwood, he tried to kill me," Eddie whispered, his voice breaking. "He said it would look like a hunting accident. He wants my inheritance." The simple, stark words hung in the air like an accusation, and Lady Beatrice felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Eleanor, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with the decisive manner that had made her such a formidable presence in the courtroom. "Then you'll stay here until we can sort this out properly," she said firmly. "No one will hurt you at Hopewell Manor. That's a promise." Outside, Sterling whinnied as if in agreement, and for the first time since his ordeal began, Eddie allowed himself to believe that he might actually survive what his uncle had planned for him. The sanctuary of Hopewell Manor wrapped around him like a protective embrace, offering not just physical safety, but something he'd never experienced before: unconditional acceptance from people who asked nothing of him, except that he heal and find his strength again. The autumn sun filtered through the tall windows of Hopewell Manor's morning room as Eddie carefully balanced a china teacup in his hands, still adjusting to the refined rituals that governed life in this stately home. 3 weeks had passed since Lady Beatrice had found him broken and hypothermic in the woods, and the daily routine of recovery had become a gentle rhythm that soothed his traumatized spirit. The hairline fracture in his leg was healing well, though Dr. Morrison had insisted he use a walking stick for another fortnight, a carved wooden piece that had belonged to Eleanor's grandfather, and somehow made Eddie feel connected to the manor's long history. "More tea, dear?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had spent decades in London's legal circles before retiring to the countryside. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex situations, whether in a courtroom or while hosting afternoon tea for the local parish council. Her silver hair was swept back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a cashmere cardigan in soft bray that complemented her sharp blue eyes. Eddie nodded gratefully, extending his cup for a refill. The ritual of afternoon tea had initially felt strange and formal to him, but now he found comfort in its predictable elegance. The way Eleanor warmed the pot with precise movements, the delicate clink of sterling silver spoons against fine-bone china, the carefully arranged selection of cucumber sandwiches and homemade scones with clotted cream and strawberry jam. It was a world away from the hurried meals and institutional atmosphere he'd endured during his brief, miserable stay at his uncle's estate. Through the French doors that opened onto the terrace, Eddie could see Sterling grazing peacefully in the paddock that Thomas Whitfield had specially prepared for him. The Thoroughbred had filled out considerably since their arrival. His coat now gleamed with health, and the nervous tension that had marked his every movement was gradually being replaced by a calmer confidence. Eddie had spent hours each day with the horse, first simply sitting nearby while Sterling learned to trust again, then gradually introducing grooming and gentle handling. "He's looking magnificent," Lady Beatrice observed, following Eddie's gaze toward the paddock. She had returned from her morning ride on Duchess and still wore her perfectly tailored riding habit: dark blue jacket with velvet collar, cream georgippas, and tall leather boots polished to a mirror shine. Her cheeks were flushed from the crisp autumn air, and her eyes sparkled with the satisfaction that came from a good gallop across the estate's rolling hills. "Thomas thinks Sterling might be ready for some light riding soon," Eddie said, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "Not jumping or anything strenuous, just gentle hacks around the property to build his confidence." Eleanor smiled at his enthusiasm. In the weeks since his arrival, they had watched Eddie slowly emerge from the shell of fear and trauma that his uncle's attack had created. The quiet boy who had barely spoken during his first days at the manor was gradually revealing a sharp intelligence and gentle humor that reminded Eleanor of her own younger brother, who had died too young in a climbing accident decades earlier. "That would be wonderful," Eleanor said, "but you must promise to be careful." Dr. Morrison was quite specific about not putting too much stress on that leg until the bone has completely healed. "I promise," Eddie said solemnly. "Besides, Sterling and I understand each other. We both know what it's like to be hurt by people who were supposed to protect us." The simple statement hung in the air, carrying with it all the pain and betrayal that Eddie had endured at his uncle's hands. Lady Beatrice felt her jaw tighten with suppressed anger, not at the boy, but at the system that had allowed someone like Sir Quentin Marwood to gain guardianship over a vulnerable child simply because of blood relations and social standing. "Your uncle has made several attempts to contact us," Eleanor said carefully, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. "His solicitors have sent rather threatening letters demanding your immediate return to Marwood Estate. They're claiming that we're harboring a minor without proper legal authority." Eddie's face went pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he set down his own cup. "You won't send me back, will you? Please, I can't go back there. He'll find another way to—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but they all understood what he meant. "Absolutely not," Lady Beatrice said firmly. "We've consulted with our own legal team, and there are proper procedures for challenging guardianship arrangements when abuse is suspected. Miss Daisy Harcourt from Harcourt and Associates has agreed to represent you. She's young but brilliant, and she specializes in cases involving minors' rights." The relief that flooded Eddie's face was almost heartbreaking to witness. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done." "Nonsense," Eleanor said briskly. "Hopewell Manor has always been a sanctuary for those who need it. During the war, we hid refugees. In the 70s, we housed political dissidents. It's simply what decent people do when they encounter suffering." Thomas Whitfield appeared at the French doors, touching his cap respectfully. "Begging your pardon, Lady Beatrice, but young Eddie's been asking about learning proper stable management. I thought perhaps he might like to start with mucking out stalls and basic grooming techniques, if his leg's up to it, of course." Eddie's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Could I? I mean, I don't want to be a burden, but I'd love to learn how to properly care for horses." "Capital idea," Lady Beatrice said. "Thomas is one of the finest horsemen in Oxfordshire. You couldn't ask for a better teacher." The afternoon dissolved into a pleasant routine of instruction and discovery. Thomas led Eddie through the immaculate stables, explaining the intricacies of horse care with the patient expertise of someone who had devoted his life to these magnificent animals. Eddie learned how to properly muck out stalls, the correct way to brush a horse's coat to bring out its natural shine, and the subtle signs that indicated whether a horse was healthy, stressed, or developing an illness. "The secret," Thomas explained, as he demonstrated the proper technique for picking out a horse's hooves, "is to move slowly and speak softly. Horses are prey animals by nature. They're always watching for predators. You need to convince them that you're not a threat, that you're actually part of their herd." Eddie nodded seriously, absorbing every piece of information with the intensity of someone who had found his calling. When Thomas finally allowed him to approach Sterling with a soft brush, the moment felt almost sacred. The horse stood perfectly still, his dark eyes watching Eddie with complete trust as gentle strokes removed the dust and tangles from his silver-gray coat. "He's beautiful," Eddie murmured, running his hands along Sterling's neck. "How could anyone hurt something so perfect?" "Same way they could hurt a child," Thomas said grimly. "Some people see beauty and want to possess it. Others see vulnerability and want to exploit it. But horses remember kindness just as much as they remember cruelty. Sterling knows you saved his life that night in the woods, and he'll never forget it." As evening approached and the staff began preparing dinner, Eddie found himself reluctant to leave the stables. The simple work of caring for the horses had given him a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. At his uncle's estate, he had been treated as an inconvenience, a burden to be tolerated until he could be eliminated. Here at Hopewell Manor, he was valued not for his inheritance or his family name, but for his willingness to work and his gentle way with the animals. "You're a natural," Thomas said as they finished securing the horses for the night. "Never seen Sterling take to anyone so quickly, not even Lady Beatrice, and she's got away with difficult horses that's almost supernatural." Eddie glowed under the praise, feeling for the first time in months that he might actually have a future worth looking forward to. The fear that had dominated his life since his uncle's murder attempt was slowly being replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed: hope. As they walked back toward the manor house, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk, Eddie caught sight of Sterling watching him from the paddock. The horse nickered softly, and Eddie felt his heart swell with an emotion so powerful it almost brought tears to his eyes. He had found more than sanctuary at Hopewell Manor. He had found a home, a family, and a purpose that no one could ever take away from him. At least, that's what he hoped. The morning started like any other at Hopewell Manor until the convoy of black Range Rovers swept through the ornate iron gates like a military invasion. Eddie was in the stables with Thomas, learning the finer points of adjusting a bridle, when the sound of expensive engines and slamming doors shattered the peaceful countryside atmosphere. Sterling immediately lifted his head from his hay net, ears pricked forward in alarm, sensing the tension that suddenly crackled through the autumn air. "What in blazes?" Thomas muttered, wiping his hands on a cloth as he peered through the stable window. His weathered face darkened as he recognized the lead vehicle. "That's Sir Quentin's car, and he's brought company." Eddie's blood turned to ice. Through the stable door, he could see his uncle emerging from the first Range Rover with the predatory confidence of a man who believed the world owed him everything. Quentin wore an immaculate Savile Row suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a year, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his pale eyes scanning the manor grounds like a general surveying territory he intended to conquer. Behind him came an entourage that made Eddie's stomach churn with dread. There was Jonathan Blackwood, Quentin's personal solicitor, a skeletal man in his 60s whose reputation for ruthless litigation tactics was legendary in London legal circles. Next emerged Victoria Ashworth Kent, a woman whose weekly gossip column in the Telegraph could destroy reputations faster than a house fire, her vulture-like gaze already cataloging details for her next scandalous piece. Finally, two men in cheap suits who were obviously private investigators, their cameras ready to document whatever narrative Quentin had orchestrated. "Eddie, get Sterling and head to the back paddock," Thomas said urgently. "Keep out of sight until Lady Beatrice can handle this properly." But it was too late. Quentin's voice cut across the courtyard with the carrying power of someone accustomed to commanding attention at hunt balls and political dinners. "Edward, come out here immediately, boy! We need to discuss your little holiday." Lady Beatrice appeared on the manor's front steps, her spine ramrod straight and her chin raised with the kind of aristocratic disdain that could freeze blood at 50 paces. She wore a simple but elegant day dress in navy wool, and her silver hair was swept back in a style that had probably been fashionable when her grandmother was young. Eleanor flanked her, equally composed, but with the sharp-eyed alertness of someone who had spent decades dismantling legal arguments in courtrooms. "Sir Quentin," Lady Beatrice said, her voice carrying just the right note of polite coldness. "How unexpected! I wasn't aware that trespassing on private property was considered acceptable behavior in your social circles." Quentin's laugh was as brittle as autumn leaves. "Trespassing? My dear Beatrice, I'm simply collecting my ward from the unauthorized custody of strangers. Edward belongs at Marwood Estate, where he can receive proper guidance from his legal guardian. Eddie emerged from the stables, despite Thomas's protective gesture, unable to hide behind others when his presence was the source of this confrontation. Sterling followed him, the horse's presence providing a calming anchor in the storm of hostility that was about to break over Hopewell Manor. Even from a distance, Eddie could see the calculating gleam in his uncle's eyes, the same expression he'd worn just before pulling the trigger in those rain-soaked woods. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Eddie said, his voice carrying more clearly than he'd expected. "Everyone here knows what you tried to do to me." Victoria Ashworth-Kent's pen was already moving across her notepad, capturing every word for what would undoubtedly become a sensationalized piece about troubled teenage heir makes wild accusations against devoted guardian. The woman had built her career on transforming private family tragedies into public entertainment, and Eddie's situation was exactly the kind of scandal that sold newspapers and generated website clicks. "Edward, my boy," Quentin said with manufactured warmth, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. That hunting accident was regrettable, but these good people have filled your head with paranoid fantasies. You need proper psychiatric care, not the enabling of well-meaning but misguided strangers." Jonathan Blackwood stepped forward, producing a leather portfolio with the theatrical flourish of someone who believed legal documents were weapons in an ongoing war. "Lady Fortescue, I have here a court order demanding the immediate return of Edward Ashton-Davenport to his legal guardian's custody. Your unauthorized harboring of a minor constitutes kidnapping under British law, regardless of your good intentions." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Mr. Blackwood, I've been practicing law since before you passed your bar exams. That document you're waving around is a preliminary application, not a court order. The actual hearing isn't scheduled for another 2 weeks, which means Eddie remains exactly where he is until a proper judge reviews the evidence." The tension in the courtyard was so thick it seemed to press against Eddie's chest like a physical weight. Sterling moved closer to him, the horse's warm presence providing comfort even as the confrontation escalated around them. The private investigators were taking photographs from every angle, documenting the scene for whatever narrative Quentin planned to construct. "Evidence?" Quentin's voice dropped to the silky tone that Eddie remembered from that terrible day in the woods. What evidence could there possibly be against a grieving uncle who's devoted himself to caring for his tragically orphaned nephew? Edward has clearly been traumatized by his father's death and is projecting his grief onto the person trying to help him heal. "The evidence that Miss Harcourt has been gathering," Lady Beatrice said calmly. "Medical records showing Eddie's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. Ballistics analysis of the area where the alleged accident occurred. Witness statements from estate workers who remember your behavior that day." Victoria Ashworth-Kent looked up from her notepad with predatory interest. "Are you suggesting that Sir Quentin deliberately harmed his own nephew? That's quite an accusation to make without absolute proof." Eddie felt the familiar surge of panic that always accompanied thoughts of that terrible day, but something inside him had changed during his weeks at Hopewell Manor. The boy who had cowered in fear was still there, but he was no longer alone. Sterling nickered softly beside him, and Eddie drew strength from their bond. "He tried to kill me," Eddie said quietly, but his words carried clearly across the courtyard. "He told me I was weak and emotional, that I would waste the family fortune on charity. He said hunting accidents happen to inexperienced boys who don't know their place." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Victoria Ashworth-Kent had stopped writing, her pen frozen above her notepad as she processed the implications of what she'd just heard. This wasn't just a custody dispute. This was a potential murder case involving one of Britain's most prominent families. Quentin's mask of benevolent concern finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "The boy is obviously disturbed," he said, but there was an edge to his voice now that hadn't been there before. "This is exactly why he needs professional psychiatric treatment, not the indulgence of people who don't understand the complexities of his condition." "The only thing I understand," Eleanor said with deadly precision, "is that you're standing on our property, making threats against a child who has sought sanctuary here. I suggest you leave immediately before I call the police to report harassment." Jonathan Blackwood made one final attempt to assert legal authority. "This matter will be resolved in court, where emotional appeals won't override legal realities. Sir Quentin is Edward's lawful guardian, appointed by his late father's will. No amount of sympathy for a troubled teenager can change that fundamental fact." As the convoy of Range Rovers finally departed, their departure marked not by the peaceful quiet that had preceded their arrival, but by a tension that seemed to hang in the air like the promise of an approaching storm. Eddie realized that his battle for survival was far from over. Quentin had revealed his true colors, but he'd also demonstrated the formidable resources at his disposal: money, lawyers, media connections, and the kind of social influence that could reshape reality to fit his narrative. "He's not going to give up," Eddie said, quietly watching the dust settle on the manor's gravel drive. Lady Beatrice placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Neither are we, dear boy. Neither are we." Sterling whinnied softly, as if echoing her determination, and Eddie felt a flicker of hope, despite the darkness that seemed to be gathering around them. The war for his future had officially begun, but at least now he wasn't fighting it alone. The morning of November 15th dawned gray and bitter over Hopewell Manor, with frost covering the ancient oak trees like a crystalline shroud that seemed to foretell the darkness about to descend on Eddie's carefully rebuilt world. He had risen early, as had become his habit over the past 6 weeks of recovery, eager to begin his morning routine with Sterling before the crucial guardianship hearing scheduled for later that day. Miss Daisy Harcourt had spent countless hours preparing their case, and today would determine whether Eddie could remain at Hopewell Manor or be forced to return to his uncle's malevolent custody. Eddie pulled on his worn riding boots and thick wool jumper, the familiar ritual providing comfort against the anxiety that had kept him awake most of the night. Through his bedroom window, he could see the stable yard where Sterling usually waited by the paddock gate, nickering softly whenever he spotted Eddie's approach. But this morning, the paddock stood empty, its frost-covered grass unmarked by hoofprints. "Sterling!" Eddie called out as he jogged across the courtyard, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The silence that greeted him was wrong, fundamentally wrong, like a musical note played off-key. Sterling never wandered far from the stable area, and Thomas Whitfield had reinforced all the fencing just the previous week to ensure the thoroughbred's safety. Thomas emerged from the feed room, his weathered face creased with concern as he took in Eddie's panicked expression. "Been looking for him myself for the past hour," the estate manager said grimly. "Found the paddock gate standing wide open, though I know for certain I secured it properly last night. Someone's been here, Eddie. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing." The implications hit Eddie like a physical blow. Today was the guardianship hearing, the day that would determine his future freedom or condemn him to Quentin's control. Sterling's disappearance wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated strike designed to destabilize Eddie at the most crucial moment possible. His uncle had demonstrated once again that no sanctuary was safe from his reach, no bond sacred enough to escape his manipulation. Lady Beatrice appeared in the stable doorway, her silver hair still disheveled from sleep, but her eyes sharp with protective fury. "Eleanor's already contacted the local constabulary," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. "P.C. Williams is on his way, and I've called the regional equestrian clubs to alert them about a stolen thoroughbred. Sterling's too distinctive to hide for long." But Eddie knew his uncle better than that. Quentin wouldn't simply hide Sterling. He would use the horse's disappearance to build a narrative that painted Eddie as unstable, irresponsible, and unfit to make decisions about his own future. The theft would be blamed on Eddie's carelessness, his emotional instability, his inability to properly care for valuable property. By the time they reached the courthouse, Quentin's legal team would have crafted a story that made Eddie appear to be exactly the kind of troubled teenager who needed strict guardian supervision. Miss Daisy Harcourt arrived within the hour, her small Ford Fiesta looking distinctly out of place among the Range Rovers and vintage Jaguars that typically graced Hopewell Manor's gravel drive. At 28, she possessed the kind of fierce intelligence and moral determination that had already earned her a reputation as one of London's most promising young barristers specializing in family law. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a charcoal wool suit that spoke of professional competence rather than inherited wealth. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said without preamble, her Yorkshire accent cutting through the morning air like a knife. "Quentin's team has been building a case that portrays you as emotionally unstable and prone to self-destructive behavior. Sterling's disappearance fits perfectly into that narrative. They'll argue that you either lost the horse through negligence or deliberately set him free in a moment of psychological breakdown." Eddie felt his carefully reconstructed confidence beginning to crumble. "But that's not what happened. I would never put Sterling at risk. He's everything to me." "I know that, and anyone who spent 5 minutes with you and that horse knows it too," Daisy said firmly. "But courtrooms deal in evidence, not emotional truths. We need to prove that Sterling was stolen, and we need to find him before the hearing this afternoon." P.C. Williams, a stolid man in his 50s who had been policing the Oxfordshire countryside for most of his adult life, approached the situation with the methodical thoroughness that characterized rural police work. He examined the paddock gate, photographed the lack of hoofprints leading away from the stable area, and took detailed statements from everyone who had been on the property the previous evening. His findings supported what they all suspected. This was no accidental escape. "Gate was opened from the outside," P.C. Williams confirmed, pointing to scratches on the metal latch that suggested the use of tools. "And there are tire tracks by the back access road that don't match any of the vehicles registered to this property. Someone came prepared with a horse box or trailer, knew exactly where to find the animal, and had enough experience to load a nervous thoroughbred without causing a commotion." The search expanded throughout the morning, involving not just a local constabulary, but a network of horse enthusiasts, farmers, and village residents who understood that the theft of a beloved animal was an attack on the entire community's values. Eleanor coordinated the effort from the Manor's morning room, her barrister's training evident in the way she organized search teams, established communication protocols, and documented every lead that came through the telephone lines. But as the hours ticked toward the afternoon hearing, no trace of Sterling had been found. Eddie paced the Manor's library like a caged animal, unable to concentrate on anything except the growing certainty that his uncle had orchestrated this entire nightmare. Quentin had demonstrated on that terrible day in the hunting woods that he was willing to commit murder to achieve his goals. Stealing a horse was merely another move in his campaign to control Eddie's inheritance. "There's something else," Thomas said quietly as he joined Eddie and Lady Beatrice in the library. "I've been thinking about the timing of this whole business. How did whoever took Sterling know exactly which paddock he'd be in? How did they know our security routines well enough to avoid the motion sensors near the main stable block? The implication was clear. Someone with intimate knowledge of Hopewell Manor's operations had provided information to the thieves. The thought that there might be a traitor among the small community that had become Eddie's sanctuary added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face grave as she held up her mobile phone. "I've just received a call from Jonathan Blackwood's office. Apparently they have a witness who saw Eddie behaving erratically near the stables last night. Someone who will testify that he appeared to be having some kind of emotional breakdown and was heard saying he wished Sterling could be free from all this madness." Eddie's blood turned to ice. The manufactured evidence was exactly the kind of psychological manipulation Quentin specialized in, taking genuine emotions and twisting them into weapons. Eddie had indeed spoken to Sterling the previous evening, sharing his fears about the upcoming hearing and his desperate wish that neither of them had to endure this legal battle. But someone had been listening, recording, and preparing to use his private moments of vulnerability against him. "It's brilliant in a completely evil way," Daisy said with grudging admiration for her opponent's tactical skills. "They steal the horse to destabilize you emotionally, then present evidence that you were already unstable and might have released him yourself. By this afternoon, they'll have you painted as a disturbed teenager who can't be trusted with his own well-being, let alone a valuable animal." The hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and as noon approached with no sign of Sterling, Eddie felt his world narrowing to a single terrifying possibility: that he would spend the rest of his minority trapped under Quentin's control, never knowing what had happened to the horse who had saved his life and become his closest companion. The boy who had found courage in the depths of those rain-soaked woods 6 weeks ago was being systematically stripped of everything that had given his life meaning and hope. "We're not giving up," Lady Beatrice said firmly, her hand resting on Eddie's shoulder with maternal protectiveness. "Whatever happens in that courtroom today, we'll keep searching for Sterling, and we'll keep fighting for you. That's a promise." But as they prepared to leave for the courthouse, Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that his uncle had already won, that the careful bonds of trust and healing he'd built at Hopewell Manor were about to be severed by forces beyond his control. Sterling was out there somewhere, probably frightened and confused, and Eddie was powerless to help him. The test of nerves had begun, and everything Eddie held dear hung in the balance. The mahogany-paneled courtroom at Oxford Crown Court buzzed with barely contained tension as Miss Daisy Harcourt rose from her seat, her dark eyes blazing with the kind of righteous fury that had made her reputation as one of Britain's most formidable young barristers. The morning's proceedings had already established the basic facts of the guardianship dispute, but now came the moment that would either vindicate Eddie's claims or condemn him to a life under his uncle's malevolent control. Judge Patricia Whitmore, a stern woman in her 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for legal theatrics, adjusted her spectacles and nodded for Daisy to proceed. "Your Honor," Daisy began, her Yorkshire accent lending an edge of working-class determination to her words, "what we present today is not merely evidence of a family dispute, but documentation of a carefully orchestrated campaign of attempted murder and psychological manipulation designed to steal a young man's inheritance and, quite literally, his life." The gallery stirred uneasily. Sir Quentin Marwood sat ramrod straight in the defendant's section, his pale blue eyes fixed on some point beyond the courtroom windows, as if the proceedings were beneath his notice. Jonathan Blackwood, his solicitor, wore the expression of a man who had just realized his carefully constructed legal strategy was about to collapse around him like a house of cards. "The first piece of evidence," Daisy continued, producing a sleek tablet computer, "comes from the security system at Marwood Estate itself. Mr. Thomas Whitfield, the estate manager at Hopewell Manor, conducted his own investigation after becoming suspicious of the circumstances surrounding Edward's alleged hunting accident. The courtroom's attention focused on the large monitor as grainy but clear security footage began to play. The timestamp showed October 15, 10:47 a.m., the morning of Eddie's near-death experience. The camera, mounted on a gamekeeper's cottage, captured Sir Quentin deliberately steering Eddie away from the main hunting party, his body language suggesting calculated intent rather than casual instruction. Note, Your Honor, how Sir Quentin checks his watch repeatedly and glances toward the isolated bluff where Edward would later fall. This is not the behavior of a caring uncle providing hunting instruction. This is the behavior of someone following a predetermined timeline. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, studying the footage intently. Even from the gallery, Eddie could see his uncle's jaw tighten as his own actions betrayed him on screen. Lady Beatrice, seated directly behind Eddie, reached forward to squeeze his shoulder reassuringly. Daisy's next exhibit was even more damning. Dr. Sarah Morrison, a ballistics expert from the University of Oxford, analyzed the physical evidence from the scene. Dr. Morrison, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair, stood from the witness box. Your Honor, the pellet pattern and trajectory are entirely inconsistent with an accidental discharge. The shot was fired from a fixed position, deliberately aimed to startle Mr. Ashton-Davenport at the precise moment he was standing near the cliff edge. This was not a hunting mishap. It was attempted murder disguised as an accident. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Victoria Ashworth-Kent, the Telegraph gossip columnist, scribbled furiously in her notebook, already composing the scandalous headlines that would dominate tomorrow's society pages. Several members of the local hunt club who had come to support Sir Quentin now looked decidedly uncomfortable with their association. But Daisy's masterstroke was yet to come. She produced a stack of email printouts with the kind of theatrical flourish that would have made Clarence Darrow proud. These communications, obtained through proper legal discovery, reveal the true extent of Sir Quentin's planning. Mr. Blackwood, would you care to read aloud your email dated October 10th, 5 days before the incident? Jonathan Blackwood's face went ashen. I must respectfully decline to—
Then allow me, Daisy interrupted smoothly. Quote, "The boy's accident must appear completely natural. Coach the beaters to confirm they heard you calling warnings about gun safety. The coroner is sympathetic to our position. He'll accept accidental death without extensive investigation. Once the inheritance is secured, we can pursue the Pakistan shipping contracts without interference." End quote. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Sir Quentin's composure finally cracked, his aristocratic facade crumbling to reveal the cold calculation beneath. Eddie felt a surge of vindication mixed with revulsion. This was his father's own brother, the man who was supposed to protect him, reduced to his true nature as a common criminal in expensive clothes. Daisy pressed her advantage ruthlessly. But perhaps the most compelling evidence concerns Sterling, the thoroughbred horse whose mysterious disappearance was clearly designed to destabilize Edward on the eve of these proceedings. She held up a small electronic device. Sterling's microchip contains GPS tracking technology, standard for valuable horses in case of theft. The data, which Sir Quentin's legal team fought desperately to suppress, tells a very clear story. The monitor displayed a digital map showing Sterling's movements on the night he vanished. As you can see, Sterling was transported by vehicle to Grimsby Farm, a facility owned by one of Sir Quentin's business associates, where he was held in a specially constructed stall designed to muffle any sounds he might make. This was not a case of a loose horse wandering off. This was kidnapping, pure and simple. Judge Whitmore's expression had grown increasingly grave throughout Daisy's presentation. She turned to address Sir Quentin directly. "Sir Quentin, these are extraordinarily serious allegations. Do you wish to respond to any of these charges at this time? For a moment, it seemed as though Sir Quentin might maintain his haughty silence. Then, perhaps recognizing that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, he stood with the rigid dignity of a condemned aristocrat facing the guillotine. "Your Honor," he said in clipped tones, "I categorically deny these preposterous accusations. The boy is clearly disturbed, traumatized by his father's death, and these good-hearted but misguided people have filled his head with paranoid fantasies. Any evidence to the contrary has been manufactured or taken out of context." But his words rang hollow in the face of Daisy's methodical destruction of his credibility. Judge Whitmore consulted her notes for several long minutes before speaking. "This court finds the evidence presented by Miss Harcourt to be compelling and credible. Sir Quentin Marwood's guardianship of Edward Ashton-Davenport is hereby immediately suspended pending criminal investigation. Temporary custody is granted to Lady Beatrice Fortescue and Mrs. Eleanor Haversham, who have demonstrated genuine concern for the child's welfare." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed for the doors, eager to break the story of one of Oxfordshire's most prominent families destroyed by greed and attempted murder. Sir Quentin's supporters melted away like snow in spring, while Eddie found himself surrounded by the warm embrace of his chosen family. Outside the courthouse, Sterling waited at the horse trailer, his silver-gray coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Thomas Whitfield had collected him from Grimsby Farm just hours earlier, following the court order that accompanied Daisy's evidence presentation. The horse whinnied softly when he saw Eddie approach, and the reunion between boy and horse was captured by every camera present. "It's over," Eddie whispered into Sterling's neck, tears of relief streaming down his face. "We're free." Lady Beatrice and Eleanor flanked him, their faces radiant with victory and love. The battle for Eddie's life and future had reached its turning point, but more importantly, it had revealed the true meaning of family. Not the accident of blood relations, but the deliberate choice to love and protect those who needed it most. The war wasn't completely won yet, but for the first time since that terrible day in the hunting woods, Eddie could see a future worth fighting for stretching out before him like the rolling hills of his beloved Oxfordshire countryside. The November night wrapped around Hopewell Manor like a shroud, its darkness broken only by the pale glow of security lights that cast long shadows across the ancient estate grounds. Eddie crouched behind the stone wall that bordered the rose garden, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Midnight was approaching, and with it, the most dangerous gamble of his young life. Despite the court's ruling in his favor earlier that day, Sir Quentin had vanished before the police could arrest him, taking Sterling with him to an undisclosed location that Eddie was determined to discover. Thomas Whitfield emerged from the darkness like a ghost, his weathered face grim with determination as he approached Eddie's hiding spot. The estate manager had insisted on joining this unauthorized rescue mission, despite Eddie's protests that he didn't want to involve anyone else in what could easily become a criminal enterprise. Behind Thomas came 2 unexpected allies. Jamie Morrison, the village blacksmith's 17-year-old son who had grown up around horses and possessed an uncanny ability to calm even the most fractious animals, and Sarah Chen, a journalism student from Oxford who had been following the story for her thesis on aristocratic corruption and had discovered crucial intelligence about Quentin's whereabouts. The GPS tracker on Sterling's microchip shows he's being held at Blackmoor Stables, about 15 miles north of here, Sarah whispered, consulting the tablet computer that had become her constant companion throughout their investigation. It's an abandoned facility that Quentin's business partner, Lord Pemberton, bought last year but never renovated. Perfect place to hide a stolen horse where no one would think to look. Eddie felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of fear and anticipation.
Blackmoor Stables had a reputation in the local equestrian community. Once a prestigious breeding facility, it had fallen into disrepair after a financial scandal involving its previous owners. The buildings were structurally sound but isolated, surrounded by overgrown fields and approached only by a single gravel road that would make their rescue attempt both easier to plan and potentially impossible to escape if things went wrong.
"We go in quiet, get Sterling, and get out," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades managing crisis situations on large estates. "No heroics, no confrontations. If Quentin or his people are there, we retreat and call the proper authorities." But Eddie knew his uncle better than that. Quentin wouldn't simply abandon Sterling to hired guards. He would be there personally, orchestrating whatever final act of cruelty he had planned. The theft of Sterling hadn't been about money or leverage. It had been about demonstrating to Eddie that no bond was sacred, no sanctuary truly safe from his reach. This was personal in a way that transcended legal documents or inheritance disputes. The drive to Blackmoor Stables took them through winding country lanes that seemed to grow narrower and more treacherous with each passing mile. Jamie navigated the darkened roads with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life in rural Oxfordshire, while Sarah monitored police radio frequencies to ensure their unauthorized rescue mission wouldn't coincide with any official law enforcement activities. Eddie sat in silence, his mind racing with plans and contingencies, trying to anticipate every possible scenario they might encounter. The abandoned stables appeared before them like something from a Gothic novel, weathered brick buildings with broken windows and slate roofs that gleamed wetly in the moonlight. Most of the facility was clearly derelict, but Eddie could see lights in what had once been the main barn, and there was a black Range Rover parked beside the entrance that he recognized immediately as one of his uncle's vehicles. His heart began to race as he realized that Quentin was indeed here, waiting for what he probably assumed would be Eddie's desperate and ultimately futile attempt to retrieve his beloved horse. "There," Sarah pointed toward a smaller building at the far end of the complex. "The GPS signal is strongest from that direction. Sterling's probably in the isolation barn. It's far enough from the main buildings that he couldn't be heard even if he made noise." They approached the facility with the careful stealth that Thomas had learned during his national service decades earlier, moving from shadow to shadow and using the overgrown hedgerows as cover. Eddie's leg, still healing from his fall 6 weeks earlier, protested the uneven terrain, but adrenaline and determination carried him forward. The isolation barn loomed before them, its wooden doors secured with a heavy padlock that looked new and expensive, clearly installed specifically to contain Sterling. "I can handle that," Jamie whispered, producing a set of bolt cutters from his toolkit. "Dad's had me breaking into abandoned buildings since I was 12. Sometimes valuable equipment gets left behind when places like this go bankrupt." The lock snapped with a soft metallic click that seemed to echo across the silent countryside like a gunshot. Eddie held his breath, expecting sirens or shouts or some indication that their presence had been detected, but the night remained stubbornly quiet. The barn door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing the interior that had been converted into a makeshift prison for Sterling. The Thoroughbred stood in a narrow stall at the far end of the building, his silver-gray coat dull with stress and his dark eyes reflecting a wariness that broke Eddie's heart. Sterling had been fed and watered. Quentin wasn't cruel enough to let a valuable animal suffer physically, but the psychological impact of captivity was evident in every line of the horse's body. When Sterling saw Eddie approaching, his ears pricked forward with desperate hope, and he whinnied softly in recognition. "Easy, boy," Eddie murmured, his voice thick with emotion as he fumbled with the stall latch. "I'm here. We're going home." But as Sterling stepped out of the stall and nuzzled Eddie's shoulder with obvious relief, the barn's main lights suddenly blazed on with theatrical intensity. Sir Quentin Marwood stood silhouetted in the doorway, no longer bothering to maintain his facade of aristocratic respectability. His expensive suit was rumpled, his silver hair disheveled, and his pale eyes burned with the kind of desperate fury that comes when someone realizes their carefully constructed world is collapsing around them.
"How touching," Quentin said, his voice carrying the same silky menace Eddie remembered from that terrible day in the hunting woods. The boy and his pet reunited at last. I must admit, Edward, your resourcefulness continues to surprise me. Most 15-year-olds would never have the courage for something like this. Behind Quentin, Eddie could see two men in dark clothing, private security contractors, probably, hired to ensure that Sterling remained captive until Quentin could figure out his next move. The odds were impossibly stacked against them, but Eddie felt Sterling's warm breath against his neck and drew strength from their bond. "Let them go, Quentin," Thomas called out, stepping protectively in front of Eddie. "The court has ruled. The police are looking for you. This is over." Quentin's laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. "Over? My dear Thomas, this is just the beginning. Did you really think I would allow a 15-year-old boy to destroy everything my family has built over generations? Edward's inheritance includes controlling interests in shipping companies, real estate portfolios, and political influence that spans 3 continents. I won't see it frittered away on charity and sentiment." Eddie felt the familiar surge of panic that always accompanied his uncle's presence, but something had changed during his weeks at Hopewell Manor. The terrified boy who had cowered in the rain-soaked woods was still there, but he was no longer alone. Sterling pressed against him, solid and warm and completely trusting, while Thomas and Jamie flanked him with protective determination. "You tried to kill me," Eddie said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the barn. "Your own brother's son, for money. For legacy," Quentin corrected coldly. "Your father was weak, just as you are weak. Neither of you understood what it means to wield real power, to make the hard decisions that preserve family honor across generations." Eddie felt the familiar surge of panic that always accompanied his uncle's presence, but something had changed during his weeks at Hopewell Manor. The terrified boy who had cowered in the rain-soaked woods was still there, but he was no longer alone. Sterling pressed against him, solid and warm and completely trusting, while Thomas and Jamie flanked him with protective determination. "You tried to kill me," Eddie said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the barn. "Your own brother's son, for money. For legacy," Quentin corrected coldly. "Your father was weak, just as you are weak. Neither of you understood what it means to wield real power, to make the hard decisions that preserve family honor across generations." The confrontation that followed would be seared into Eddie's memory forever. His uncle's desperate attempt to maintain control, the sudden chaos as Thomas and Jamie fought with the security contractors, and his own terrifying moment of choice as Sterling reared and struck out with his hooves, creating the distraction they needed to escape into the November darkness. The race back to Hopewell Manor through narrow country lanes, with headlights pursuing them and Sterling's trailer swaying dangerously behind Thomas's Land Rover, felt like something from an action movie rather than the quiet countryside life Eddie had come to love. But they made it home, and as dawn broke over the ancient oak trees that had guarded Hopewell Manor for centuries, Eddie knew that he had finally found the courage to claim his own destiny.
The first rays of December sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows of Hopewell Manor's library as Eddie sat curled in the leather wingback chair that had become his favorite retreat during the past month of healing and reflection. The events of that terrifying night at Blackmoor Stables had fundamentally changed him, stripping away the last vestiges of the frightened boy who had once cowered under his uncle's manipulation, and revealing something stronger, more resilient, and infinitely more authentic than he had ever imagined possible. In his lap lay a leather-bound journal that Eleanor had given him, a place to record his thoughts and process the trauma that had nearly destroyed his life, but had ultimately forged him into someone he was proud to be. Outside, Sterling grazed peacefully in the paddock closest to the manor house, his silver-gray coat gleaming with health and contentment as he moved with the fluid grace that marked him as one of England's finest thoroughbreds. The horse had recovered completely from his ordeal in captivity, but more importantly, he had emerged from the experience with a deeper trust in human beings and an unshakable bond with Eddie that transcended the typical relationship between rider and mount. They had saved each other in ways that went far beyond physical rescue. Sterling had given Eddie the courage to survive that first terrible night in the woods, while Eddie had provided Sterling with the patient, gentle care that allowed him to heal from years of abuse and neglect. Thomas Whitfield approached the paddock fence, his weathered face creased with the kind of satisfaction that comes from witnessing genuine transformation. "Never seen a horse so devoted to his human," he said, as Eddie joined him at the rail. "Sterling won't even let the stable lads near him when you're not around. It's like he's appointed himself your personal guardian." Eddie smiled, running his hand along the smooth wooden rail that surrounded Sterling's domain. The relationship between him and the thoroughbred had become a source of wonder for everyone at Hopewell Manor, not just because of its intensity, but because of the way it had become a metaphor for the kind of loyalty and trust that couldn't be bought or commanded, only earned through consistent kindness and mutual respect. In a world where his uncle had demonstrated that blood relations meant nothing when weighed against greed and ambition, Sterling had shown Eddie what true partnership looked like. "He taught me something I never learned from my family," Eddie said quietly, watching as Sterling lifted his head and nickered softly in their direction. "Loyalty isn't something you inherit or demand. It's something you give freely because you choose to, not because you have to." Lady Beatrice emerged from the manor house wearing her riding habit, her silver hair catching the morning light as she approached them with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent a lifetime managing both horses and people with equal skill. The past weeks had seen her transition from reluctant rescuer to fierce protector, and now to something even more precious, a chosen mother who had filled the void left by Eddie's father's death with wisdom, warmth, and unwavering support. "Miss Harcourt just rang," she announced, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Eddie's heart leap with hope. "Sir Quentin's assets have been frozen pending the criminal investigation, and he's been formally charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to defraud. The Crown Prosecution Service is confident they have enough evidence for conviction, thanks largely to the security footage and GPS data we uncovered." The news should have filled Eddie with triumph, but instead he felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness that surprised him with its intensity. Quentin was still his father's brother, still the man who had bounced Eddie on his knee as a toddler and taught him to tie his shoes. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of its cruelty, but because it represented the complete corruption of everything Eddie had once believed about family and honor. "I keep thinking about something my father used to say," Eddie murmured, his voice barely audible above the gentle sound of Sterling's breathing. "He told me that being born into privilege wasn't an accomplishment, it was a responsibility. That real nobility came from how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you in return." Eleanor appeared on the terrace with a tea service, her movements graceful despite the weight of the silver tray she carried. The ritual of afternoon tea had become one of Eddie's favorite parts of daily life at Hopewell Manor, not because of the ceremony itself, but because it represented the kind of civilized, caring environment where people took time to genuinely listen to each other. It was everything his uncle's cold, calculating world had pretended to be, but never actually was. "Your father would be proud of the man you're becoming," Eleanor said, as she arranged the delicate china cups with practiced precision. "Quentin may have had the title and the estate, but he never understood what true aristocracy means. It's not about the size of your bank account or the number of properties you own. It's about standing up for people who can't defend themselves, even when it costs you something precious." The conversation that followed wound through topics that would have seemed impossibly mature for a 15-year-old just months earlier. Eddie found himself discussing philosophy, justice, and the meaning of honor with the kind of depth that comes only from having faced genuine evil and chosen to respond with courage rather than hatred. His experiences had accelerated his emotional growth in ways that no traditional education could have achieved, forcing him to grapple with questions about identity, loyalty, and moral responsibility that most people didn't confront until much later in life. "I used to think that being strong meant never being afraid," Eddie said as he sipped his tea from one of Eleanor's grandmother's spode cups. "But Sterling taught me that real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do the right thing even when you're terrified of the consequences." The afternoon dissolved into a gentle routine of stable work and quiet conversation that had become the foundation of Eddie's new life. He groomed Sterling with the kind of meditative focus that transformed a simple chore into a form of therapy, working methodically through the Thoroughbred's coat while processing the complex emotions that still surfaced whenever he thought about his uncle's betrayal. The rhythmic motion of the brushes and the warmth of Sterling's body provided an anchor point for thoughts that might otherwise have spiraled into bitterness or despair. Thomas joined them in the stable as evening approached, carrying a worn leather bridle that had belonged to his own father decades earlier. "Been thinking it might be time to start your proper riding lessons," he said to Eddie. "Not the basic stuff we've been working on, but the kind of advanced techniques that'll make you and Sterling a real partnership. Horse like that deserves a rider who can match his skill." The prospect filled Eddie with excitement tinged with nervous anticipation. He had been riding Sterling bareback around the paddocks for weeks, but formal equestrian training would represent another step toward claiming his place in the world that had tried to reject him. More than that, it would be a way of honoring the bond between him and Sterling by developing their partnership to its fullest potential. As night fell over Hopewell Manor and the staff began their evening routines, Eddie found himself standing once again at Sterling's paddock fence, watching the horse settle down for the night with the kind of peaceful contentment that had once seemed impossible for either of them to achieve. The boy who had fallen, broken, and bleeding into those rain-soaked woods had been transformed by trauma into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than he could have imagined. The journey wasn't over. There would still be court dates, media attention, and the complex process of rebuilding his relationship with the inheritance that had nearly cost him his life. But Eddie no longer feared the future with the desperate anxiety that had once consumed him. He had learned the difference between family by blood and family by choice, between inherited privilege and earned respect, between the hollow performance of nobility and its authentic expression through service to others. Sterling nickered softly in the darkness, and Eddie felt his heart swell with gratitude for the horse who had saved his life and the people who had given him a home where he could finally become the person he was meant to be. The lessons of loyalty, honor, and identity had been learned not through lectures or textbooks, but through the lived experience of betrayal, rescue, and redemption that would shape every choice he made for the rest of his life. The spring morning air carried the scent of cherry blossoms and fresh-cut grass across Hopewell Manor's immaculate grounds as Eddie adjusted his black graduation cap for the final time before stepping onto the makeshift podium that had been erected on the south lawn.
6 months had passed since Sir Quentin's arrest and subsequent conviction, and in that time, Eddie had completed his GCSEs through private tutoring while simultaneously establishing the Ashton-Davenport Foundation, a charitable trust dedicated to supporting at-risk youth and equine therapy programs throughout Britain. Today marked not just his 16th birthday, but also the official launch of a new chapter in his life that would honor both his father's memory and the hard-won wisdom he had gained through surviving his uncle's betrayal. Sterling stood patiently beside the podium, his silver-gray coat gleaming in the morning sunlight, as he wore a ceremonial bridle crafted by Jamie Morrison from the finest English leather. The Thoroughbred had become far more than Eddie's companion. He had evolved into a living symbol of resilience and renewal, demonstrating to everyone who witnessed their partnership that healing was possible even after the most devastating trauma. The gathered crowd of journalists, charity representatives, and local dignitaries watched with obvious admiration as boy and horse moved together with the kind of intuitive understanding that spoke to something deeper than mere training.
"Ladies and gentlemen," Eddie began, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had learned to speak truth to power through bitter experience. 6 months ago, I stood in a courtroom and heard evidence about a man who believed that family legacy was more important than family love, that inherited wealth mattered more than inherited values. Today, I want to talk about what real nobility means in the 21st century, and why it has nothing to do with the size of your estate or the antiquity of your family name. The assembled crowd leaned forward with obvious interest. Among them sat Lady Beatrice and Eleanor, their faces glowing with maternal pride as they watched their chosen son claim his rightful place as a voice for progressive change within Britain's traditional social structures. Miss Daisy Harcourt, now a close family friend rather than just a legal advocate, smiled from the front row as she recognized the echoes of arguments they had crafted together during those tense months of legal preparation. The England my father loved wasn't defined by hunting parties or hereditary titles, Eddie continued, his hand resting lightly on Sterling's neck for emotional support. It was defined by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Teachers who stayed after hours to help struggling students, nurses who worked double shifts during the pandemic, farmers who fed the nation while battling floods and droughts. These are the true aristocrats of our time, and their nobility comes not from bloodlines but from service. His words carried across the manicured gardens toward the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of British history, each generation grappling with questions of identity, purpose, and social responsibility. Eddie had spent countless hours walking beneath those trees with Sterling, processing the trauma of his uncle's betrayal, while gradually understanding that his survival had given him not just a second chance at life, but a platform from which to advocate for others who faced similar struggles.
The Ashton-Davenport Foundation will partner with schools, youth centers, and therapeutic riding programs to ensure that no child faces the kind of isolation and vulnerability that almost destroyed me, Eddie announced, producing a leather-bound document that represented months of legal preparation and fundraising efforts. We believe that every young person deserves a sanctuary like Hopewell Manor, not necessarily a grand estate, but a place where they can heal, grow, and discover their authentic selves. Thomas Whitfield stepped forward with the ceremonial scissors needed to cut the ribbon that stretched across the foundation's new headquarters, a beautifully renovated stable building that would serve as both administrative center and demonstration facility for equine-assisted therapy programs. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. What had once housed horses owned by aristocrats for sport would now provide healing for children from all backgrounds who needed the kind of unconditional acceptance that only animals could provide. Before we proceed with the ribbon cutting, Eddie said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, I want to acknowledge the people who showed me what chosen family actually means. Lady Beatrice and Eleanor didn't rescue me because they had to. They did it because they believed that love and loyalty are choices we make every day, not accidents of birth we inherit. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Eddie could see deeper emotions in the faces of his audience. Many of them were parents themselves, and his story had resonated throughout Britain as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that blood relationships automatically guarantee safety or love. The Foundation's work would address not just the symptoms of youth trauma, but the systemic failures that allowed predators like Sir Quentin to exploit family structures for personal gain. Sterling nickered softly as the scissors approached the ribbon, as if he understood the significance of this moment for his human partner. The horse had recovered completely from his ordeal in captivity, but more importantly, he had learned to trust again in ways that served as daily inspiration for the troubled children who would soon benefit from the Foundation's programs. His journey from abuse to healing paralleled Eddie's own transformation, and together they represented hope for anyone who had survived betrayal by those who were supposed to protect them.
The Old England believed in inherited privilege, Eddie said, as the ribbon fell away and the crowd burst into enthusiastic applause. The New England believes in earned respect. The Old England measured worth by lineage and title. The New England measures worth by character and contribution. Sterling and I represent that transition. We're not special because of our bloodlines, but because we chose to turn our trauma into a force for positive change. The reception that followed took place in Hopewell Manor's formal gardens, where tables laden with traditional English fare, cucumber sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, and proper afternoon tea served from sterling silver services created an atmosphere of refined celebration that honored both tradition and progress. Eddie moved through the crowd with easy confidence, equally comfortable discussing therapeutic riding techniques with university researchers and chatting about upcoming polo matches with members of the local hunt club who had once supported his uncle but now recognized Eddie as the true inheritor of his father's values. "You've become quite the public speaker," observed Victoria Ashworth-Kent, the Telegraph columnist who had once been prepared to destroy Eddie's reputation but now served as one of the Foundation's most vocal media supporters. "Have you considered a career in politics? Britain needs young voices who understand both tradition and the need for reform." Eddie smiled, his gaze drifting toward Sterling, who was surrounded by a group of children from a local youth center, who had been invited to experience their first equine therapy session. "I think I'll stick with horses and helping kids," he replied diplomatically. "Politics seems to bring out the worst in people, while horses bring out the best." As afternoon melted into early evening and the last guests departed with promises of financial support and volunteer commitments, Eddie found himself alone with his chosen family on the terrace, overlooking the grounds where his new life had truly begun. Sterling grazed peacefully in the distance, his presence a constant reminder that healing was possible even after the most devastating betrayals. "Your father would be enormously proud," Lady Beatrice said, her arm around Eddie's shoulders as they watched the sun set over the Oxfordshire countryside. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you've become. You've taken the worst thing that ever happened to you and transformed it into something that will help thousands of other children." Eddie nodded, feeling the deep contentment that comes from finding one's true purpose in life. The Foundation would be his life's work, but more than that, it would be his legacy. Proof that authentic nobility comes not from inherited wealth or ancient titles, but from the daily choice to serve others, to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, and to build a world where every child has access to the kind of sanctuary he had found at Hopewell Manor. The story that had begun with a desperate boy and a traumatized horse in rain-soaked woods had evolved into something far greater, a testament to the power of chosen family, the importance of speaking truth to power,
and the endless possibility for redemption that exists when people choose love over fear, service over selfishness, and authentic connection over hollow tradition. Britain's true aristocracy, Eddie had learned, consisted not of those born to privilege, but of those who chose to use whatever advantages they possessed in service of others, and that was a nobility anyone could claim, regardless of their bloodline or bank balance.